Some say that, all the living and the dead will be raised and they'll be judged on the basis of their good and bad deeds.
Mm-hmm.
And the Quran gives us this picture that there will be, every person has scrolls, 2 scrolls that are being recorded on. An angel is recording all your bad deeds and another angel is recording all your good deeds. And depending, as those scrolls are unraveled before Allah, the longer one's going to determine your fate, whether you go to paradise or whether you go to hellfire for eternity. There is also, though, some pictures in the Quran that suggest that there will be surprises at the last day, where there will be some who are Muslims and devout Muslims who will be in hellfire, and there will be those who are not Muslims who will be in paradise. So there's some tension there. Muslims they have a way of working these things out.
Yeah.
And then there's another picture in the Quran that says where one ends up after the judgment is determined even before you're born. So like a kind of a double predestinarian view of salvation and damnation, that Allah has already predetermined it even before you're born. Some are reprobate. I don't know that they would use that language. It's more like Calvinistic language, but then some are elect.
Welcome back to On the Line. Today, we had the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Adam Francisco, who is one of the leading apologists in the Lutheran Church, and he's probably the leading voice on understanding what Islam actually believes. He's somebody who speaks Aramaic. He knows the Quran, many of it by heart. You'll see him quote different scripture verses from the Quran. So this is just a great opportunity for us to learn, what does Islam really believe and how does it intersect with our Christian beliefs? So we hope that you enjoy this episode. As always, if you can like this video, leave a comment on Apple Podcasts. These kind of things help our platform grow and reach more people with the messages that we work to share here on this platform. So we hope you enjoy. God bless. Right, and Bennett says we're live. Dr. Adam Francisco. Very excited to sit down with you.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
And we are, for those watching, we've been in a couple different places recording. So we're at Bethany Lutheran College in Mankato. So this is a very different setup. We don't have like the table and everything. So we're like within reach. And you know jujitsu. So so I've really got to be kind of careful here. But yeah, if you want to tell our guests our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, joined the Navy right out of high school, got out of the Navy, went to college, and was going to go to seminary. In fact, did a quarter or a term, I guess they call it, at seminary.
Which seminary?
St. Louis.
St. Louis, yeah.
And had also applied to basically kind of get my old master's degree supervisor to stop asking me to apply for a PhD. Just applied for a PhD and was accepted while I was at seminary, and decided to, and I had other people telling me I should go and do the PhD because I had applied to do some historical work, but also tangential to Islamic studies. And that was 2001. And people were saying you should do this because we don't have an Islamic guy. We had a few, but they were retiring and things like that. So did that, came back in 2005, I think, back from England. And
where did you go?
I went to University of Oxford.
Oxford, so yeah. C.S. Lewis is...
Yeah, I can I say this on air? I drank many a pint at the Eagle and Child pub where Lewis and Tolkien and others
I've been there,
used to hang out. It's closed now, sadly, but...
oh, maybe I haven't been there then.
No,
this was 2013.
Yeah, it would have been around still.
Okay, yeah.
They closed it, and I mean, who cares? Nobody cares probably about this, but it might reopen. We'll see. After Oxford, my first teaching position was at Concordia College in New York, or Bronxville, New York. Yeah. And then from there, went to Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne for 3 years and taught there as a visiting professor of historical theology. And they have a PhD in missiology with an Islamic emphasis. So they had brought me out there for that piece, and Christian apologetics as well. And then I got a call. It was actually my first call to teach at Concordia Irvine, which is where I did my undergraduate and a little bit of graduate work.
That's in Southern California.
Southern California, yeah. And we moved out there, lived there. I taught there for 10 years. It was a blast. Saw a university kind of be transformed into a, I don't know, not necessarily a great books university, but it had a great text core curriculum. Is really exciting. But then I got a call out to Concordia River Forest as an administrator, and 3 years of administrative work was enough for me. And
You lasted 3 years.
I did. I could have lasted longer maybe, but I got an opportunity with an organization called 1517 that I couldn't pass up, and got some of my freedom back and re-platformed, I guess would be the word of the day, to do specifically Christian apologetics and working on Islamic studies, and in a way, not in an undisciplined way, but whatever strikes my fancy. So just as long as I'm productive. So
you've got the freedom to explore the different topics you're interested in.
Yeah, it's sort of like the old, it is the old fellow model, where somebody works at an institution as a fellow, where they're just sort of there as kind of a think tank type of position. So yeah, I'm enjoying that. And that's where I am now. My wife and I live in Wheaton, which is a western suburb of Chicago. We have 4 kids, and kind of have a revolving door of other kids in our house too, with foster care and other things. So that's my life in a 4-minute nutshell, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely excited to learn, some more about Islam. And that's where your name came up in a couple different areas. People have, recommended, hey, if you could get Adam Francisco on. Just so happened you were coming here to Minnesota, so that was just perfect. But a couple of people were like, if you can get him to talk about Islam, which is something we haven't explored. And to your point, it's something that most people don't, when people ask me questions on Islam, I can give them very base, here's a couple things I know, but I haven't read the Quran. I don't know Aramaic. I don't really know the culture other than just kind of, maybe YouTube videos or, just kind of dabbling in it. So, so maybe you can just kind of walk us through. So like maybe as a starting point, like as people, most of our audience is Christian, not all of our audience, but what should they kind of start at if they're going to try to understand Islam and the differences, or like where do we start?
Yeah, that's a big question given the day and age we live, where it's, there's all sorts of conflicting accounts of what Islam is, in the mainstream media and in the popular academic works. You go to Barnes and Noble and let's say you want to learn about the Muhammad, the so-called prophet of Islam. You might have an account written by a contemporary author that draws on the primary text, the earliest text, Muslim text, or you might have a biography written by a kind of liberal-leaning person that will completely sugarcoat the life of Muhammad. And so it's hard. It's discerning the sources. That's a important thing in understanding Islam, especially if you're the outsider looking in. And for your people who are watching or listening to this, if they have any contact with Muslim people, they probably know, like probably all religious traditions, every individual is going to have their different spin on it, right? And with respect to Islam, there are different traditions within Islam. They don't have denominations like in Christianity, but they certainly do have different legal and political and social, even ethnic tradition or ethnicities that kind of inform the various Islamic traditions. So, but if there's something, I always recommend to people, if you want to learn about Islam, you could, of course, read the Quran. The Quran's not an easy text to read, and every Muslim will tell you that every translation of the Quran is in essentially kind of an interpretation. Like that's true with any text, you know. So, but there are some that have been they've been certified, I guess, or approved by authorities in the Muslim world. The ones that come out of Saudi Arabia, there are 2 in particular that are in the estimation of conservative Muslims, fairly reliable reflections of the Arabic text, in English.
So is Islam really founded in the Quran? Like, is that kind of like the starting point, or is there more of like a history that kind of starts with and the Quran comes later?
So another great question. if you're somebody who wants to learn about Islam and you love reading primary sources and you've got a lot of time on your hands, I mean, the Quran would be the place to go because but again, it's a complicated text. It's 114 chapters, roughly the length of the New Testament. But it's not put together chronologically. It's put together, I mean, it's been described by Muslims themselves as piecemeal. So it's hard to follow any sort of story. And to your question just a minute ago, there's a complicated, maybe a nuanced history behind Islam, and a history that we're starting to learn even more about now that the real critical inquiry into the foundations of Islam have kind of started ever since roughly the 1970s. So there's the traditional received narrative about what Islam is and where it came from. Then there's those who are saying, well, wait a minute, maybe these sources that are written 200 years after the events aren't the most reliable, especially in light of the fact that we have other sources that are earlier, though they're not written by Muslims. So it's a big complicated mess, and maybe I've confused things. But if we want to talk about what Islam is and where it comes from, the best, the real quick story is that in the early 7th century, there was a roughly 40-year-old man in the Arabian Peninsula, where what we call Saudi Arabia today. He was a native of Mecca, which is about halfway down the Arabian Peninsula on the western side. His name was Muhammad. He was, his dad died before he was born. His mother died shortly after he was born. He's kind of passed around and eventually is cared for by his uncle. In his early life, he, according to the earliest biographies that we have, he was a merchant and had a reputation of being an honest and trustworthy man. And he caught the eye of a wealthy woman named Khadijah when he's about 25 years of age, and they marry. And then his life kind of changes because he's no longer has to work as he once did. So from about 595 to 610 AD, he spends most of his time, according to these early biographies, and these early biographies aren't necessarily the best sources, but that's all we've got. He spends most of his time reflecting on religious and philosophical questions that he had. As a merchant, the biographies say that he would spend a lot of time in the Arabian Peninsula, of course, but he would also travel up into the old eastern half of the Roman Empire, Byzantium. And when he's up there in places like Syria, he must have had some sort of contact. In fact, the biographies say he had contact with Christians and Jews and perhaps some Zoroastrians and so on. So he lives at a time where there's some religious diversity of a sort. And the way the biographies describe it is that he's pondering, which religion is the true religion? Because they're all teaching different and conflicting things. And for 15 years, he's asking himself this question. And the story goes that in 610 AD, in the 9th month of the Arab lunar calendar, a month called Ramadan, he's in a cave or a little indentation in the Rocky Mountains to the east of Mecca, and he's asking himself these questions, and he starts to feel a presence in the cave. And he's pushed to the floor of the cave because the presence has gotten so strong. One source says that the cave is illuminated by light, and an angel named Jibril or Gabriel begins to speak to him and tells him that Allah is the creator of all things, and that he has taught men, or he has taught humankind, perhaps we might say, in the past by the pen, meaning that Allah has revealed himself before he's revealed himself to Muhammad. So with regard to the history of Islam, while Islam begins with Muhammad in terms of where it pops up in the historical record, informed Muslims who know their theology well will say that Islam is not a new religion. It's not just something that pops up with Muhammad in this early 7th century, but Islam, according to the Islamic tradition, the traditional perspective on Islam is that Adam, the first man to be created, was in fact the first prophet in Islam. And so when you read the Quran, one thing that kind of surprises Christian or non-Muslim readers is just how many times Jesus is mentioned, or Moses is mentioned all over the place. Solomon, Adam, Noah. There's 23, 24 names in the Quran that are all biblical names. And the way Muslims will explain that is before Muhammad, there's a long train of prophets that begins with Adam that Allah has raised up and sent to the various communities that have emerged on the planet since he created. Some Muslim theologians will say that it's not just the 23 or 24 named in the Quran, but there have been over 100,000 prophets. That is, there's a passage in the Quran that says Allah has never left himself without a witness. He's always raised up prophets, and they've always taught, while their ethics or the laws they brought may have differed with relative to their particular time and place, they've always agreed on their theology, if you will.
Okay. So some kind of natural law, would it be like that? Like there's kind of a natural law?
There is a natural law tradition in Islam. It's kind of a minor tradition.
Okay.
I mean, they'll speculate on natural law. For them, it's sort of, I mean, I kind of mean this in jest, but it's sort of like in the Lutheran tradition where we recognize, because it's a biblical doctrine, that there's the law written on everybody's heart. We call that natural law. But it's so hazy that it's maybe not the most helpful thing, especially when you've got a special revelation in Scripture. So why not go right there? And Islam has sort of a similar approach to law. But the theology, according to traditional-minded Muslims, has always been the same. And you can break Islamic theology down to 5 basic points. The Quran, in fact, says there are 5 beliefs that are standard across the Muslim board, with some exceptions, especially with heretical Muslim communities. There's a Muslim community in America known as the Ahmadis or the Ahmadiyya movement.
Okay.
They're sort of like the Muslims in the Mormons in the Muslim world. They found their way to America and other non-Muslim countries because they were persecuted for so many years, especially in the eastern parts of Iran. So they fled as refugees. And they were persecuted for a reason. I don't think it's a good reason, but from a Muslim perspective, they taught something that was completely contrary to what the Quran had taught. So, but for Muslims whose theology is informed by the Quran or by a preacher at their mosque who's a traditional preacher, Islam has 5 core doctrines. The first is the doctrine of what's called Tawheed, or the unicity of Allah, the unicity of God. And for the readers the listeners or the viewers, I'm not suggesting that the God of Islam is the same as the God of Christianity, but Allah can't be translated in any other way than God.
Yeah.
So God is one, but the doctrine of Tawheed is not just sort of an assertion or a confession of monotheism. And I should also add that monotheism in Islam is an exclusive Unitarian monotheism. That is, there is no plurality within the oneness of God. There is no allowance for a trinity. The Quran says probably in about 5 or 6 places that Allah is one, he does not have a son. It rejects. In fact, there's a passage towards the end of chapter 4 that tells Christians not to be too excessive in their religion. Do not say of God that he is 3 in 1. Do not say tathlitha. Do not confess the doctrine of the Trinity. That's an exaggeration or an innovation within this long Islamic tradition.
So Muhammad, again, you've said he's probably interacted with Christians and with Jews and with
Zoroastrians. That's kind of the Persian religion that would have made its way.
So he's clarifying here. He's saying we're not Christian. We don't believe in God in the same way. When I say Allah, I'm speaking of something that's qualitatively different.
And that gets over the course of Muhammad's life. So he's going to be in Mecca for about 10 years he's going to see himself as a prophet. And it takes a little while for him to actually be comfortable with it.
And this is after his cave experience.
Yeah. And in the Quran, there are passages that come from that particular period, from 610 to 620 AD, called the Meccan period. And it's pretty basic stuff. God is one. If you don't turn from your polytheism, because the traditional Arabs were polytheistic, if you don't turn from that, you're going to spend an eternity in hellfire. That's kind of the message. And it doesn't sit very well in Mecca. So there's a light persecution breaks out there, but it begins to escalate towards 620 AD, where there are attempts on Muhammad's life. So it seems he looks for a way out, and he's invited to come up to a city to the north. It's about 170 miles to the north of Mecca. It was called Yathrib. They changed its name when he moves there to Medina to Nabi, the city of the prophet. We call it Medina today. And that's where you find the message of Islam and all its nuance really starts to unfold in the Quran. That's where you get Muhammad confessing or asserting the Islamic doctrine of monotheism over and against, say, Christianity.
Okay.
But so this doctrine of Tawheed, the unicity of God, also refers to it's an exhortation that Muslims are to make God one in their life. That is, they ought not have any competitors with God. Whether that's for a Muslim might tell you, a conservative might tell a Christian that they have divinized Jesus and set him up as if he's a competitor with God or Allah, the creator of the universe. Or some might say they would exhort Muslims to make God one by not allowing other influences in their mind and how they think about politics or law, but rather simply Allah and his will should be the only authority and or at least the highest authority in their life, such that nothing should be competing with that. Nothing should be influencing their interpretation of the world or how they live and move and have their being in the world apart from Allah and his will as it's expressed in the Quran. So
how does that compare and contrast with our first commandment?
So I would say there's parallels. Do the lines converge? Not really, because it's a different God. But I would say where the real differences are, though, for Christianity, to be sure, we confess God as one, and we have no other gods but Him. For Christians, that's very much a theological, worshipful disposition towards God. Does it include the nuances of how you're to dress? No. That's not to say that it's a free-for-all for Christians when it comes to ethics and law. But for Islam is one thing Christians oftentimes don't get about Islam is that while it is theological, in that theology is a pretty comprehensive
a legal system?
Yeah.
Okay.
There is no there's no two kingdom doctrine in Islam, if you will. There is no separation of church and state or secular from sacred, or however you want to put that. The law of Islam, the Sharia as it's typically called, is part of that whole theological matrix. And in fact, the law is even more important than what one believes about God. So that's all
helpful,
wrapped up in that is the most important thing for Muslims, the doctrine of Tawheed. That's the first doctrine, and that's the doctrine that kind of encapsulates everything else.
Can I go back to some of the historical things?
Yeah,
I kind of want to get a picture. So Muhammad, he grows up, he's a merchant, becomes wealthy. Now he's thinking about who God is, right? So now he's probably interacting with Christians, Jews. What's the other one?
Zoroastrians.
I'm going to get that one by the end, right? And he's coming out of, correct? You're saying the Arab world where he's coming out of is a polytheistic, so it's a pagan type empire and culture, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I wouldn't call it an empire. It's up until the time of Muhammad, and when he moves to Medina, the Arabian Peninsula, at least all the evidence that we have suggests that mostly they're nomadic. The people in Mecca are a little different because they, the Kaaba is there, the that square-like structure with a black.
Oh, where they walk around?
Yeah, where when they're on their pilgrimage, they'll circumbobulate. Is the technical term.
Okay,
But, according to Islamic tradition, has been around long before Muhammad.
Mm.
Some would go so far as to assert that Adam built that as the first mosque.
Mm.
Some would say that. Most, maybe all, would say certainly it was around the time that Abraham lived. In fact, there's a like a stone in the one of the corners of the Kaaba that's black that they say was once white, and Abraham and Ishmael actually placed it there in the corner. The reason why it's black now is because when Muslims, for all these 1,400 years now, and maybe even back to the time of Abraham, they would say, when they go there and circumambulate it or walk around it 7 times, I think it is, they will try to kiss it. And every time they've kissed it, it absorbs the sins of the people. Mm-hmm. That's why it's black now.
Okay.
So that building, before Muhammad, or even in Muhammad's early life, it's said by Muslim tradition was a sort of hot spot for Arabian polytheism. That it was said to have contained at least 360 different idols. And as the Bedouins, the Arab nomadic tribes, would make their way through the desert, they would stop in Mecca and they would pay fees to the Quraysh tribe, that's Muhammad's tribe, to enter in, and they would venerate the various idols that their particular tribe venerated. Mm-hmm. But the people of Mecca, their whole livelihood is largely dependent on those entrance fees that they're charging. So when Muhammad comes around and starts preaching against that, that's what's going to cause the Meccans to turn against Muhammad. Mm-hmm. So they're not a unified people. This is what's curious with Muhammad. If the biographies are recounting real, verifiable history, it's with Muhammad that we get the Arabs unified for the first time, at least for centuries. Mm-hmm. And the people to the north, so the Persian Empire to the north and the Christian Byzantine Empire to the north, for them, the Arabs they were nomadic people. They weren't really that much of a concern. So they didn't even have standing armies really protecting their borders. Mm-hmm. So when Muhammad dies and the Muslim armies begin marching, they put an end to the Persian Empire pretty quickly. And they conquer most of Byzantium within a century's time. And Islam becomes an empire and the largest, quickest expanding empire the world had seen to that point in time.
So that takes place after Muhammad dies.
Yeah.
So does Muhammad ever lead like military excursions?
He does. He does. In the Arabian Peninsula,
So as part of uniting that area, that's kind of what he's doing.
Yeah. And that takes place from 620 to 632, roughly. Mm-hmm. He dies in 632. He's working at building up an alliance, mm-hmm. Either by military force or by some sort of diplomacy, mm-hmm. depending on the nature of the tribe he's interacting with. He will also work at one of the things that's maybe relevant for our times with the rise of, especially with the Israeli-Palestinian issue right now. You start to see, we call it anti-Semitism if you want. Mm-hmm. The Quran and the biographies of Muhammad tell us that in addition to uniting the Arab tribes, he unites them in such a way that he puts himself up or forward, and part of the conditions for uniting with Muhammad is accepting him as a prophet. And there were the Quran suggests that there were some monotheists in the Arabian Peninsula, Jewish monotheists in particular. Mm-hmm. And in Medina, there are 3 tribes there. 2 of them refuse to accept Muhammad as a prophet, and so they flee. They end up in Persia, mm-hmm. it seems. One of the tribes, the Qurayza tribe, decides to stay put. They say, we've been in Yathrib longer than you. We have every right to exist here. And to make a long story short, both the Quran more than hints at it. The biographies tell a more fuller account, but on one morning, Muhammad accuses them of treachery or treason, and he calls all the males out and has them dig ditches of the Qurayza tribe. He lines the men up along the ditches and cuts off all their heads, about 700 in total, and then takes their women and children as slaves and concubines. And you find a kind of an Islamic anti-Semitism already in the Quranic text, such that the Quran even refers to or has Muhammad telling the Jewish people that Allah has cursed them such that their status in terms of their humanity is been reduced to the status of apes and pigs. So, and that all takes place in Medina as he's consolidating and shoring up, building this unified Islamic kingdom, if you will. Though they didn't call it a kingdom. It looks like a kingdom to us, but it becomes an empire pretty quickly after his death as it expands northward.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah. So in that time where he's at Medina, right? Because that's the place that he flees to up north. Is that right? So he's in Medina. At this point, you know, those first 10 years, right? He's kind of speaking against the polytheism, and then he's articulating rest of the Quran while he's getting these followers and stuff. So is it at that point that he's really kind of like cementing what the Islamic people have to confess?
Yep.
And he's doing it over and against Christianity and Judaism?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And in fact, interesting thing with the Quran is that you can find passages that there's tension, if not contradiction between passages. So, for example, towards the end of the Quran, there's a passage where it's from Mecca, and Muhammad is, the context is the pagan polytheistic Arabian leaders there in Mecca are asking Muhammad for some sort of reconciliation, stop preaching such vitriol against our polytheism. And Muhammad says, well, he kind of agrees to it. It says, you have your religion, I have mine. You'll worship who you worship, I'll worship who I worship. It's chapter 109 of the Quran. It's just 6 verses long. You find passages like that where he's making some concessions for the sake of peace, I guess, maybe to alleviate the persecution against him. And then you'll find passages like Quran chapter 9:5 that speaks to how Muslims, and this is in Medina, are to address polytheists like the ones in Mecca. Polytheists are usually called mushriks in the Quran. And chapter 9, verse 5 is sometimes called the verse of the sword in the Quran, where it says, kill the mushrikun, indiscriminately, if you will. So how are those contradictory verses reconciled? In the traditional line of reasoning in the Islamic tradition is if a passage is a Medinan passage or a later passage, and it contradicts something from an earlier episode of Muhammad's life, it's said to abrogate the earlier passage. So there's a sense that Allah was revealing himself through an angel to Muhammad in a progressive sort of way. And the way I've seen it explained in Islamic literature is Allah in his wisdom knows that in Mecca, he had to slowly, incrementally reveal his message because in order to pull along as many followers as he could.
So it's kind of utilitarian in that way?
Yeah. And I mean, Muslims obviously would reject this, but Allah comes off as a very capricious God when you're reading the Quran. He kind of, it's not that he flip-flops, but he's he contradicts himself and and changes his mind and so on. So
in a very short period of time.
Yeah. So Medina, like to your point, before I went on that tangent, in Medina, those Medinan passages in the Quran really set the tone and tenor of Islam. So you get, the very clear confession or assertion of monotheism over and against even other monotheistic traditions. You get a strong assertion of Allah being the creator. Now, there's nothing in the Quran that says he created from nothing, but it's implied or assumed that Allah created everything, both visible and invisible things, including angels and jinn or genies. He created humankind. Adam is the first man to be created. His consort is never named, but in his later Islamic tradition, they'll give her the name Eve. Are created early on as the capstone of Allah's creation. And there's an interesting story in chapter 2 of the Quran that says when Allah decides he's going to create man, he tells the angels that he's going to create man, and he's going to create him with free will, and the angels protest and says, don't do that, because they'll abuse their free will, perhaps like the jinn or the genies did. And
so they have an idea of fallen angels, sort of?
That's where the story is fascinating, because so Adam's created, and he's placed in paradise, which is not on earth, but it's in the second or third layer of heaven. And Eve is created. And as Adam's created, as the story goes, Allah commands the angels that they're to prostrate themselves before Adam. He is the capstone. It's not men are a little lower than the angels, but rather angels are a little lower than men or humankind in the Islamic framework. And so Allah orders the angels to prostrate themselves. They prostrate themselves, but there's one among them that's standing up. And it was a genie, which is different than an angel. An angel has no free will. They do Allah's bidding. Genies were given free will, and there's a group of them that rebelled. The one standing up, as they're all prostrating before Adam, was named Iblis. He had been invited in the company of angels because he was such a pious genie. And as he's standing up, he refuses to prostrate himself before Adam. He's cast out of the company of angels, and his name is changed to, you could probably guess it, Satan or Shaitan. And he leads the rebellion. He leads other jinn or genies into rebellion against Allah. And not every Muslim is going to see it this way, especially as Muslims begin to modernize and secularize. But traditionally, or traditional-minded Muslims believe that much of what goes on in time and space, whether you get sick or calamities that happen, what we might call the natural evils,
like a hurricane. I mean, I don't know if they have hurricanes in the Middle East, but something along those lines.
Yeah, things like that, or the individual who gets tempted into sin. That's not a result of a fallen created order. It's not a result of a person who is by nature sinful and unclean. It's because the enticing of the jinn. The whispering of the jinn are pulling you off Allah's straight path, or pulling the created order off its straight path. And so therefore in Islam, one thing that's interesting from a Christian perspective, especially for those Christians who are interested in speaking the gospel to Muslims, and Christians should be interested in that, I would hope.
Yep.
You can't assume that a Muslim is going to have a problem with their sinfulness the way we have a problem with our sinfulness. Because for them, human beings are not by nature sinful and unclean. Human beings are, in a sense, perfectible. To be sure, in Islam, the Quran says that Adam and Eve disobeyed Allah. They ate from the fruit of a tree in the middle of paradise. In their tradition, it's not an apple, it's a fig. And Allah causes them to fall, like literally or physically to fall from paradise down to earth. But once they land there, they are forgiven of their sins. They're absolved of their sins. They are wiped clean, and Adam is called or given the first words from Allah. He is raised up as the first prophet of Allah. So there is no sense of inherited guilt or shame from our first parents' fall. So a sin in Islam is a moral failure, to be sure. It's an affront to Allah's justice or righteousness, but it's not such an affront that one can't do better. One can do basically. I mean, the sort of basic way of thinking about it is for Islam. If you do more good deeds, that outweigh your bad deeds, then you can be not confident of your salvation, but fairly confident of it. There is a doctrine of predestination in Islam as well that kind of confuses the picture, but that's for maybe a master's level discussion.
Yeah.
On Islam.
Yeah, so that's it. So like we have like the world, the devil, the world, and your sinful flesh, right? They've got their primary one is really the devil or this jinn. Yeah. Like that's the main adversary. Yeah. That's
the jinn, the great whisperer, Shaitan, and all the ideas and distractions in the world you live that are the result of the the genie's pulling the world into sin, pulling the world away from Allah's straight path. So like in traditional, real classical Islam, the ideal is for a Muslim. It hasn't been for about 100 years that Muslims have seriously entertained whether or not Muslims can live in non-Muslim lands. Before that, the answer was no. You could do business, you could engage in jihad in non-Muslim lands, but you couldn't live there permanently because you couldn't really live a upright Muslim life unless your society followed Allah's will. So living in non-Muslim lands, and like real austere Muslims believe that most of the world is non-Islamic, including Muslim majority countries, because they're not entirely under the Sharia law. So the problem with the law not being Sharia law is that the things that are then allowed in a society that are an affront or contradict what Allah has prohibited are enticements away from this what's the Quran calls it the sirata mustaqim, the straight path. That everybody born, whether they are Muslim or not, as they grow up, intuitively knows. It's this. You asked about natural law earlier. There is in Islam a concept that it's called fitra. This original disposition or the original nature of humankind and the created order. If it weren't for the jinn, would be in line with Allah's will.
So do they see non-Muslim, people or these, nations, do they think of them as under the control of that jinn?
In the more like traditional circles, to be sure. I hinted at earlier, with respect to understanding Islam from a Muslim's vantage point, it's, they're all over the map. You've got very progressive, modernized Muslims. You got very traditional Muslims, and everybody in between. So it's hard to know how a Muslim would see things. However, Iran has since 1979, with the Iranian Revolution, referred to America as the Great Shaitan. And so, absolutely, like non-Muslim lands or non-Muslim ideas, secular ideas, whether they're political or what have you, aren't necessarily, but are oftentimes seen as competitors or enticers away from Allah and His will.
So I've got some theological questions, but I've got some other ones maybe before we kind of get into the theology, and then we can maybe even compare and contrast, Christianity and Islam, or kind of give the hearers kind of an understanding of what areas, especially to push back against. But I've got some. So Ishmael. Is Ishmael, right? Because Ishmael's back at Abraham's time, right? So I've always wondered that, to where I've heard some people kind of claim that that's the beginning of Islam, and then some people don't. So there's kind of some misconceptions there. But what are you talking about? You're talking 2,500 years or so between Ishmael and Muhammad. So is there a connection there that they claim, or no?
That's at the very least, it's a Christian interpretation of where Islam comes from, based on, and I can't remember chapter and verse anymore, but when Ishmael is born, he's sent away, and then there's these words that God speaks, the true God speaks, that in a sense blesses Ishmael, but says he will be basically a thorn in his descendants will be a thorn in everybody's side. Historically, since I think probably the earliest Christian to do this was John of Damascus, and he was 7th, 8th century, and he's got a work that catalogs all the heresies that had emerged within Christianity since the 1st century. And the last heresy he calls the heresy of the Ishmaelites, and that's Islam. And he argues that genealogically, and in fact, the Muslim biographies of Muhammad do trace Muhammad's genealogy back to Ishmael. So it's not just, it is a Christian interpretation of that history, but it's an interpretation that there's certainly support for it in the from Islamic tradition as well. From a more modern Muslim perspective, I think they see Ishmael as a prophet in Islam. alongside Isaac too. His I guess they would be stepbrothers or
Yeah, I guess so.
half
Yeah.
brothers, I guess. So yeah, but
So that's not like a bedrock of it, really.
I
That's
would,
something that's
yeah.
at least peripheral.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question. So I've heard this said, and you can I don't know if this is completely wrong or not, but I've heard that like the Arian controversy,
Mm-hmm.
that is, I've heard the theory, and this could be completely wrong. I've probably read 2 paragraphs on this total, right? But that the Arian heresy kind of took root in Islam, and that's very much what kind of led Muhammad's thinking.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting
Mhm.
conversation. Something like that was alleged already back at the time of John of Damascus. This catalog of all these heresies. He says of Islam that Islam is essentially, though he doesn't call it Islam, he just calls it the heresy of the Ishmaelites, is essentially an accumulation of all the heresies, all 99 heresies that he catalogs, vomited up through the mouth of Muhammad. So there's always been this, Christians historically have always tried to find influences on Muhammad's life and teachings, or influences on whoever wrote down the Quran for the first time. And the Christology of the Quran, if we could speak of it in that way. I mean, the Quran does refer to Jesus quite a few times, over a dozen, maybe 24 times. And there are certain passages in the Quran that narrate some aspects of Jesus' life from apocryphal traditions on Jesus' life. And Jesus is referred to as Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, or Jesus the Christ. And the Christology of Jesus in the Quran is akin to an Arianism of a sort, meaning Jesus is not divine. He is a creature. He might be a special creature, but he's not co-eternal with God the Father and the Holy Spirit. Now, if I can, I could probably go on at great length on this because I'm really interested.
Go for it.
In the
Yeah,
topic.
I'm interested in this. Yeah.
Some recent research on the source material behind the Quran, which is still, it's not in its stage of infancy anymore, but it's still relatively new because just people, unlike the Bible, where there's hundreds of years of scholarship, and especially since the days of the Enlightenment, real critical scholarship on the Bible. There hasn't been a whole lot done on the Quran until like the 1970s, where you start to see, especially Western scholars, try to understand what's going on behind the Quran. Like, what's the context behind it? What are the source materials? They were very skeptical, go figure, of the traditional Muslim claim that when Muhammad spoke under inspiration, people just memorized it. And about 20 years after his death, they wrote it down, and it's been perfectly preserved ever since. Western scholars have never accepted that based on naturalistic or whatever assumptions. And so you get some earlier attempts to locate source, not necessarily per distinct sources, but like if your listeners are familiar with like the theory about the queue,
which they probably aren't. So if you want to,
so
explain
like
that.
in biblical studies, especially with respect to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there are, there's many believe that Mark was at least one of the sources for Luke, and perhaps also Matthew used Mark, but there's also they had to have other sources. The assumption,
and this is a higher critical type thing. This would not be mostly, an Orthodox Christian.
Mostly, not totally. Like Luke tells us that he consulted all sorts of sources, right? And so, well, what are those sources? Is it just Mark, or is it just eyewitnesses? Could there have been other documents? Could Matthew? Some say, because there's an early church father that says Matthew first wrote in the tongue of the Jews, like Aramaic. So it's kind of pointless to talk about a Q source,
which is the unknown source.
Because there's
we
nothing
don't have
tangible
to.
that you can point to. But people have done that, and most of them have been these higher critics, who have assumed a priori, without even doing any real serious historical research, that miracles can't happen, that Jesus couldn't have fulfilled all these, thousands of years old prophecies, so because the Gospels have these in them, they have to have arisen from some sort of historical background where these legends about Jesus, evolved and so on.
Mhm.
It's all rubbish. I'm actually at this conference. The reason why I'm here in Mankato because I'm talking about that very topic tomorrow.
Yeah.
But people are now doing that with the Quran. And while I disagree with the presuppositions, and so Christians ought not necessarily adopt those naturalistic assumptions when looking at Islam critically, it is kind of interesting some of the stuff these scholars have come up with. For example, Christoph Luxemburg, which is a pseudonym, years ago published a book with a real exciting title called The Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran. I mean, who wouldn't pick that off the shelf?
Yeah,
and
Bennett's
excited
got
to
it
read
on his shelf at home.
And then you scroll or you thumb through it. There's like, images in Syriac and Arabic. It's like a super scholarly work. Christoph Luxemburg, when he was reading he's a scholar of Arabic and Aramaic, Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, and other languages from the Mediterranean Rim in the time period that Islam emerged. And when he read the Quran, he noticed, and people have known this Muslims have noticed this for centuries, that there are places in the Quran that though they use the Arabic script, they seem to borrow from a vocabulary that's not an Arabic vocabulary. They use loan words. But the Quran claims it's written in pure Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
And so those passages that seem to have borrowed from other languages and just rendered them in Arabic script. Christoph Luxemburg said, well, I wonder if Syriac was the lingua franca at the time, I wonder what would happen if I just not translated, but just replaced the Arabic letters with Syriac letters to those places that really are hard to understand using Arabic grammar and vocabulary. What I'd find? So that's what he did. He took what he calls he calls them the Christian passages in the Quran, because there's a narrative of Jesus' birth to the Virgin Mary in the Quran. So
they call Mary a virgin.
Yeah, to be sure. Now, it's slightly different than the New Testament accounts, but Mary is the only woman named in the Quran, and she's regarded as a virgin. So Christoph Luxemburg just transliterated these passages into Syriac. And what he found was when you transliterate them into Syriac, it's actually very easy for a person who knows Syriac, all 5 of them across the world.
Yeah.
There's probably more than that, but it's very easy to understand these passages because they're from the Syriac language. They follow the rules of Syriac grammar. Then in addition, he found that some of these passages are a literal one-for-one match from heretical Christian liturgical material, in particular like Nestorian Christians who were living, I don't know if thriving's an exaggeration, but were living and quite freely living on the eastern outpost of the Byzantine Empire.
So they would have been very accessible.
They would have been very close to the Arabian Peninsula. And in fact, there's been some archaeological finds that demonstrate that Nestorian communities, some heretical like Jewish communities, they were out of the empire because they're heretics, but migrated down towards the border between Persia and Byzantium and the Arabian Peninsula. So all that to say, and there's lots of examples of this, and by lots, I mean probably a couple dozen examples of stories in the Quran that seem a little out of place, or the linguistic features of it are a little wonky from the perspective of Arabic grammar. And you can find their almost one-for-one match in these other sources. Now, a Muslim, of course, would object. Their view really is that when the Quran was written down around 650 AD, about 20 years after Muhammad's death, the people who wrote it down had memorized. They were called muezzins. They had memorized everything that Muhammad said perfectly, and they transcribed what he said. And so what was originally written in the Quran is a perfect preservation of what Muhammad spoke. And then as it's been copied through the centuries, it's been perfectly preserved as well. Now, the facts say something otherwise. But that's the story, and they'll stick to it. So they would object to there being source material behind the Quran, but there's data that's increasing showing that there was some borrowing, and there is a doctrine in Islam that says Muhammad was an unlettered man. That's usually taken to mean he was illiterate. Historically, though, Islamic tradition mean what they meant by he was unlettered is that he didn't have access. He had not read other scriptural or religious sources.
So he's receiving the story of Adam from Allah. He's not interacting with
correct,
Christians or heretics or anything like that. He's just being revealed to him.
Yeah, that's the Orthodox tradition, Islam. Yeah.
So is it fair to suppose, as you look at that, would you come to the conclusion, that Muhammad, he's searching, for answers. He's kind of looking around. He's a merchant. He's traveling around. He's interacting with maybe some Christians, maybe some Jews, maybe some of the
Zoroastrians. Yeah.
But
then Freddie Mercury, he was a Zoroastrian. If you know the singer Queen.
Oh yes, yeah. Okay, interesting.
There's like 400,000 of them in the world today. They're kind of a small dying religion.
And they're dying.
Anyway.
Yeah. But he might be also interacting then with these heretical groups, right?
Yeah.
And then could suppose then he's taking these things back and he's kind of sifting through them and kind of trying to synthesize all of this and kind of come up with his own teaching. And then he's teaching this stuff, and this is kind of new news for the people. So they're kind of gravitating towards that. And then all of a sudden there's this opportunity to find this unity and to kind of create maybe not an empire as they would call it, but it becomes an empire. Is that a fair supposition?
Yeah, that's one of the theories out there, or one of the historical explanations of why you get this, what seems like borrowing. There are other theories, hypotheses out there. Most will say, it's hard to say whether Muhammad did this or not, but most likely it happened when the Quran was being written down. Because there is Islamic tradition that says, to be sure, there were these, and I think I called them muezzins earlier, they're hafizes, these memorizers of what Muhammad said. That is in the Islamic tradition. But there is also this interesting story that when they actually did put the Quran down, they thought they had a fixed text, a canonical text, but people objected and said, wait a minute, I don't remember Muhammad saying this, or I recall him saying this instead of that. And so there was some sort of, this is in the earliest Islamic sources, there was some controversy over, like, what's the right reading of the Quran? And what did Muhammad really say? And the sources say the third caliph, a guy named Uthman, instructed his secretary, Zayd bin Thabit, to decide. And all the other sources that conflicted with that, that was maybe written down on parchment, leather or something like that, or on pottery or whatever, little fragments of whatever Muhammad said. If it contradicted what he decided was the final canonical version of the Quran, he was to destroy it. So there is a spurious history to the Quran. And then, if I can dive just a little deeper on this, in terms of manuscripts of the Quran that we have that we're fairly confident are authentic, probably the earliest date to pretty early on, late 7th century. So maybe just a couple decades after the Quran was originally written down. There are some Muslims who say that we have the original Quran. That has yet to be proved, but there's a German scholar named Gerd Puen who's a expert on, and imagine this as your expertise, Arabic paleography.
Oh boy!
So he knows what style of writing, of cursive or script, was used in different decades in the course of the Arabic language, and so he's able to date a Quranic manuscript that was discovered in the 1970s in an attic of a mosque in Yemen. And after he did probably painstaking research, unraveling the scrolls so that they don't break and looking at the text and so on, he was able to, he argues that this is a 7th century manuscript based on the paleography, and they probably did other tests of the pollen and maybe the ink and so on. It's a late 7th century manuscript. What he noticed, though, is that the manuscript is also what's called a palimpsest. And there's lots of, there are a few examples, maybe even more than a few examples of palimpsest in ancient and late antique history. That is a manuscript that you can tell had a text underneath it. That is, so like parchment, for example, very expensive. It's made from leather,
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody's writing a text on there and they make a mistake in the ancient world, rather than just tossing it, what they would typically do is they would just take water and scrub out the ink
Mm-hmm.
and reuse the parchment or the leather.
Mm-hmm.
And what this manuscript found it's called the Sana'a manuscript from Sana'a, Yemen. What Gerd Puin noticed is that there's at least 2 layers underneath the top layer of the Quran.
Mm.
And so through like technology, I think laser technology, they were able to discern what the other 2 layers are. And what it is a earlier version of the Quran.
Mm.
So it looks like the Quran went through some type of editorial process. So
Interesting.
now what all that means, we can't say, until more evidence comes to light. But
can they read what the earlier one says?
Parts of it, yes.
Parts of it, okay.
Yeah. And
so
that's
not
all
enough to like be able to say, here's this earlier version, but they can see
correct.
like a couple lines here and there that differ. And,
yeah. So what you get, I mean, to be fair, is in the manuscript tradition of the Quran, if you look at it over the centuries, is there are variant readings of the Quran. There are scribal errors, misspellings, things like that don't make a difference, just like with what you have with the New Testament manuscripts. Mm-hmm. Things that don't matter in terms of its general reliability. But if you have a doctrine that says the Quran has been perfectly preserved every time it's been written down or copied thereafter, that poses a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been attempts. To my knowledge, it's still not been published in a complete edition. But for about 20 years now, especially out of Germany, there's been this attempt to put together a critical edition of the Quran that would have the authorized Arabic script, on the main part of the pages, but would have footnotes down to the bottom of the page that would tell you what manuscripts render a passage or a word or differently. Mm-hmm. You went to seminary, so you used. I presume you used the Nestle Aland version of the Greek New Testament. I won't tell you if you still read it or ask you if you still read it or
Thank
not.
You.
But it's like lots of footnotes to all these variants where maybe John's name is spelled with 1 new or N or 2. These little things, and that doesn't matter in terms of the reliability.
What we believe in, yeah.
For if you have a doctrine of perfect preservation, it does matter. And so Angelica Neuwirth, a German scholar, when she announced around 2004 or 5-ish, she was going to produce this critical edition of the Quran, and in a couple of years, I mean, people like nerds like me were like pretty excited, and we waited and waited and waited. It never came out. I don't know. I've not verified this, but the word I hear, the word on the street, is that it's just too dangerous of a prospect. So
that there be violent pushback.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's just sort of part of the business of dealing critically with Islam, or has been. Not always. That's not to say, to be fair, that's not to say that all Muslims are that way. In fact, it's a relatively small percentage, I think.
Yeah.
But there is always that danger.
Mm-hmm. One more question, then maybe we can move to the kind of theological side and understanding kind of what Islamic practice looks like. So what would the Islam, how do they view like the Old Testament and the New Testament? Like, are they like, yep, like that's also from God, or certain areas?
Question. Yeah. And a helpful question for Christians trying to understand Islam, especially if they have relationships with Muslim people, because Muslims will point out that they too believe in Jesus. They too respect the Torah and so on. So if you read the Quran, one thing that you'll get struck by is that the Torah is mentioned quite a bit. What's called the Zabur, usually translated Psalms, written by Dawood or David, are mentioned. The Injil, somehow a result of Jesus' ministry, is mentioned. And then I think it's just one place refers to Suhuf, scrolls of Abraham, which have been lost. If you know anything about the Mormon tradition, and their quad, there's the scrolls of Abraham. Apparently, the Mormons have recovered that lost text. That's a joke,
yeah.
by the way.
Yes,
but
yeah.
but it is in the Mormon tradition. But Muslims claim it's been lost. But they'll refer to these texts, and just like their belief that there have been prophets, include Moses and Jesus loom large in the Quranic recollection of prophets before Muhammad that were Islamic prophets. They believe there were books before the Quran that contained Allah's revelation through Moses, through David, and through Jesus. So the Quran, and I don't mean this to be irreverent, but the Quran pays lip service to the Old and New Testament, if we could use that for shorthand. Not the epistles of Paul. Muslims believe Paul is like this great imposter. But there is at least some lip service, some reverential lip service to that there have been other scriptures before the Quran.
But they wouldn't take them as authoritative?
Right.
Okay.
Because, and one of the reasons why, if you were to like say, oh, that must mean if we open up the first 5 books of the Old Testament and compare it to the teachings of the Quran, it would maybe not be exactly the same, but there wouldn't be contradictions. And especially like with the gospel, if you compare any Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John to the teachings of the Quran, you're going to find a ton of contradictions. So how do they make sense of that? Well, those earlier books, when they were originally written, the original autograph, if we could get the original autograph, they would be pristine and there would be no contradiction between them and the teachings of the Quran. And Muslims would have to acknowledge that those are God-breathed or Allah-breathed scripture. Historically, Muslims have always asserted, though, that the reason why copies of those original autographs are not subscribed to in Islam is because they have in some way been corrupted. And there's 2 different ways that's explained. One is the meaning of the Torah, for example, has been corrupted by a Christian reading of the text. So Deuteronomy 18, starting at verse 15, Moses predicts that a prophet will arise from Israel who will be greater than him. Christians interpret that as a messianic prophecy. Muslims say that's a corrupted interpretation of the text. That text clearly refers to, even though it says from Israel, clearly refers to Muhammad. Some will go a little further and say, in fact, if we had the original autograph of Deuteronomy, when Moses makes that prediction, he actually names Muhammad, perhaps uses a nickname, so to speak, of Muhammad called Ahmed. Others will say, in that example of corruption, or tahrif as it is in Arabic, they'll say the actual text itself has been corrupted. So,
do they have any evidence? Is there any manuscript that they would point to? Or? Well,
this is where it gets interesting for the Christian apologists. It's not. I don't think it's the case anymore. But if you were to, as we're wont to do, go to YouTubeislam.com. I mean, who doesn't start their morning research with that, right?
That's right.
At least this dork did for a while. If you were to go there and type in New Testament or Bible or something like that, the first hits, the first videos would be all linked to Bart Ehrman, a New Testament text critic. I think he's more of a higher critic than he is a text critic, who has made his claim, or his fame is derived from writing books that argue that there are so many textual variants in the New Testament documents, the manuscripts that we have, that it just is no longer reliable. There are lots of variants, but does that mean it's not reliable? I mean, when you consider that we have upwards of 30,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, if we include like Latin and other translations from the Greek, you can, somebody misspells John's name, that number is going to escalate pretty quickly. So, so Muslims that's the evidence they will use, but more often than not, it's mostly conjecture. So when Jesus promises the Paraclete in John chapters, is it 14 through 16 or 16 through 18?
Yeah, that upper room discourse. Yeah.
Yeah. He
certainly 16. Yeah.
He promises
16,
that I think it's Parakletos or Parakleton in Greek. There was a South African Muslim apologist who made the bold claim that if you were just to change one vowel and one consonant in the Greek to parakletos, you would get a Greek word that if you translate it into Arabic would be Ahmed. And you go to Quran chapter 61, verse 6, where Jesus, Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, the Quranic Jesus, gives this prediction that there will be a prophet who comes after him, and his name will be Ahmed. Ahmed is another name for Muhammad. It's a synonym for Muhammad. So
it's a lot of jumps.
So they will make assertions of real textual, like where there's been real intentional additions to the text or subtractions from the text, but they don't have like hard evidence of the stuff they're talking about. Now they can point to like some of your, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but like the ending of the Gospel of Mark, starting at Mark chapter 16, verse 9, there's always a footnote to that section in Mark in your Bibles that say some early manuscripts don't contain this longer ending of Mark. They'll point to things like that. But if you just do a little work, you realize that, it's not found in these 4th century manuscripts, but there is references to it in some earlier sources. So it's an issue, to be sure, in the transmission of New Testament manuscripts, but it's not an issue that affects the general reliability of the text. So, that's opening up a can of worms and would take us off topic if we got into that, though.
Which would be interesting to maybe next time we have you on, we can explore some of that stuff. So, so how would the Quran, or how would, maybe we can just, go with those traditional Muslims, right? And probably start there, because it would be tough to kind of navigate all the different nuances. But so the traditional Muslims, the Quran, how do they understand Jesus?
Great question. So Jesus appears, I said earlier, quite a bit in the Quran. He's referred to quite a bit. His name is Isa. Isa is the way it's usually rendered in using English letters. Al-Masih. The way that's usually translated, Jesus, the Messiah. The Messiah, when Al-Masih is more of an honorific title rather than like a Messiah promised in the Old Testament. There is another Messiah in Islamic theology called the Mahdi, and that's more of a apocalyptic.
Someone to come in the future.
Yeah. And there's all sorts of wild discourse and conjecture on that between like Iran and the Sunni tradition and so on. But that's...
Maybe we can jump into that in a little bit.
The Quran has a picture, envisions a man named Jesus who was given the title the Messiah, who lived around the time of Caesar Augustus and Tiberius Caesar, though the Quran doesn't name those two emperors. But they generally will concede that they have in mind that Jesus. But the narrative, if you can piece it together from the different parts of the Quran of Jesus, is quite different than the eyewitness accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Mark and Luke being companions of eyewitnesses. Jesus, there's quite a few stories of Jesus in his early life performing miracles, like breathing life into clay pigeons, which probably I tend to think are probably taken from these non-canonical gospels that you may have heard of that were written like 3rd and 4th century.
Like Gospel of Judas or Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah, that sort of material, because there are some infancy gospels and they contain these stories, right? I think the story of breathing life into clay pigeons, not the type you shoot with shotguns, but like the trinkets,
like if you had a little like one sitting on your
your mantle
like
or something.
Metal,
I'm pretty sure that's found in the Gospel of Thomas, if I'm not mistaken. But
which would validate the earlier idea that Muhammad was interacting with these and he's getting these ideas from these texts.
He's at least hearing about them. Whether he's reading them or is a different question. So you'll find stories about his early life where he performs miracles like that. He also, the Quran does say that he gave restored sight to the blind. He raised the dead and performed other miracles. In his what we would call his ministry, his 3-year ministry. Where things get really interesting, though, is as his life comes to an end, if you will, is the Quran chapter 4, starting around verse 156 or 157, has this curious passage where it's Allah speaking. He says, "The Jews boast that they killed Al-Masih, the Messiah. They did not kill him, nor did he die. Rather, he was taken from them. And the way Islamic exegesis or tradition understands that passage is that at the end of his life, Jesus escaped being arrested and was taken up into heaven. He never died. So therefore, he didn't rise from the dead. Was taken up into heaven, and he's awaiting his return at the last day. So Jesus is when you asked about the connection to Arianism, he is a creature in Islam, but he's a special kind of creature such that he never did die. And he's going to, at the last day, chapter 5 of the Quran has this picture of everybody being raised from the dead, and everybody who's living is raised up and they're judged. And the image is sort of like Christians are in like one big group. And Allah asked Jesus, pointing to the Christians, did you tell these people that they should take you as Lord, Rob, alongside Mary? And Jesus says, I would have never taught them such a thing. So you get Jesus kind of disowning Christianity. And you also get a weird understanding of the Trinity in the Quran when it says, did you teach them that they should take you and your mother Mary as deity as alongside God the Father? Is kind of what's implied there.
So they're almost implying that like Mary is the Holy Spirit or something like that?
Well, so it gets confusing there. Because elsewhere in the Quran, I think it's chapter 4, verse 171-ish. I've learned that adding ish to the end of a word is very much a Chicago thing.
Yeah.
But I think it's 4:171 refers to Jesus as the Kalimatullah, the word of Allah, and also refers to this other thing, the Ruhallah, the spirit of Allah, like a Holy Spirit. So it's the Quran's, Muslims wouldn't say it this way, of course, but kind of confused on what the Trinity might be.
Yeah.
One more thing I passed over, I forgot to mention, is the Quran does, you pointed this out earlier, does regard Jesus as being born of a virgin. Chapter 19 of the Quran gives a kind of a narrative of Jesus' birth where Mary's pregnant. She's not married. She's a virgin. She leaves her family. It doesn't say she left Nazareth or anything like that, but she leaves her family or her people and goes out into the wilderness to give birth. And as the story goes along, it's chapter 19 in the 30s. She gives birth. Jesus is in a cradle out in the wilderness, and he's looking up at Mary, and he sees that Mary is distraught because now she's got to go back, and she's got a child. She's not married, and so how's she going to explain this? And seeing that she's distraught, Jesus speaks from the cradle. He gives his first miracle. He says, Mary, do not be concerned. It'll be okay. I'm adding that to the text. I am a prophet of Allah. That's his first miracle. So they definitely believe that Jesus, including there's a figure named Yahya, I think he's mentioned just a few places in the Quran, that they oftentimes will interpret as John the Baptist, are prophets of Allah. So our view of Jesus for them is not the historical view, and is it pulls from some history concerning Jesus, but adds in all this like mythology. For them, they could say, like 2 Peter objects to or claims that this is not a cleverly devised myth. For Muslims, our view of Jesus is in fact maybe a not so cleverly devised myth. And usually, if they go on to explain how it all happened, they'll usually point Paul. They'll say the first Christians, the original followers of Jesus. In fact, there's a massive medieval Islamic polemic and apologetic directed at Christianity is called "How to Respond to an Excellent Response to Those Who Follow the Religion of Jesus," and it argues extensively that the disciples were all Muslims. It's when Paul arrives on the scene that he changes the message of Jesus by fusing Jewish monotheism with Greek polytheism. The compromise was a Trinity. So now there's no evidence for that, right? But that's not an uncommon claim. Sayyid Qutb is a pretty famous 20th century Muslim. He was connected with the Muslim Brotherhood. He wrote a work on sometimes it's entitled that hideous schizophrenia, where it traces the history of the rise of secularism from the Christian tradition.
Mm.
But he tells the story of how Paul invented what you and I regard as orthodox, small o, orthodox Christianity.
Mm.
And the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, in their recollection of that, of history, or their view of history, probably a better way of putting it, is when you get the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of the deity of Christ. It wasn't around originally.
Mm.
Now, historically speaking, that's my thing is history. That's complete rubbish and flies in the face of brute historic facts, even from non-Christian sources, hostile sources. Very clearly, there's a Roman source written by a man who had Christian blood on his hands, where he describes Christians, I think around 112 AD, getting up on Sunday morning and singing a hymn to Jesus as if he was God. So you got Christians very early on, like attested by non-Christian sources, regarding Jesus as God incarnate. So when I've, in the past, I haven't done this in some time, but when I've had not like formal debates, but more like conversational type of debates with Muslims. I did one in a mosque in South Bend, Indiana, I believe it was, maybe 15 years ago. And it was a conversation over the Christian and the Muslim view of Jesus. And I took the Christian view. Maybe that's obvious. And at the end, the Muslim scholar, we were able to ask each other, we had a cross-examination. And I asked him, why it is he believed in his view, the Quranic view of Jesus, which comes from a 7th century text, over and against a view of Jesus that comes from eyewitness testimony in the case of Matthew and John, and companions of eyewitnesses in the case of Mark and Luke, and sources that had no interest in promoting Jesus, like Josephus or Tacitus or Suetonius. And his answer was really quite surprising to me. He said, because I am a Muslim first and a scholar second. And the way I would interpret that is he prefers his ideology over the facts. And that's one of the big hangups you'll find with any sort of Christian Muslim discourse. And it really kind of stops the conversation. If they're going to prefer or place a 7th century text over against eyewitness testimony, there's really no way of getting around that obstacle, unless you can use the tools of like Christoph Luxemburg and these critics of the Quran now to show that the Quran is an assemblage of various religious traditions.
So we covered Jesus. Oh, actually, I did have a question there. Was there something with their story about Jesus not dying, right? So they think he was just kind of brought up. Was there something with Judas?
Yeah. So that's not in the Quran, but it is in his early Islamic tradition. And it's quite, if a Muslim knows their tradition and will give you an explanation, who was put on the cross? Because very clearly somebody was crucified under Pontius Pilate alongside those two, those thieves or brigands or revolutionaries.
Like you said, there's a lot of historical, even just Roman documents
you don't need Christian tradition to tell you that happened. The usual explanation is that when Jesus being a prophet knew the authorities were coming for him, and so in the upper room at the Last Supper, he looks around his disciples and he tells them what's up, and asks them, who wants to take my place? And Judas raises his hand, and the way it's described, it's as if his face is transformed, like a divine facelift of something, such that he begins to look like Jesus, and Jesus sort of just disappears from history. And Judas is arrested and crucified in his place.
And he actually looks like Jesus.
Yeah.
So that Mary could still be there and be like,
yes,
this is my...
Exactly, yeah. There is another tradition, it's not as strong, that says that Jesus was arrested and that he went through a trial, that he was flogged and was carrying a crossbeam to Golgotha. But in that mix-up, and I forget which gospel explains it.
Like with Joseph of Arimathea?
Simon the Cyrene.
Oh, Simon the Cyrene, yes, yeah.
When that mix-up happens, I think it's the Gospel of John where that's recorded, that Simon the Cyrene, people confused him for Jesus, and he was crucified in Jesus' place.
And Jesus escaped.
Yeah. So now there is there's a book out there called Jesus in India that says that it's from this Ahmadi tradition, which is kind of a heretical tradition within Islam, that argues so Jesus wasn't taken up into heaven right away, but rather he just kind of moved eastward looking for the lost tribes of Israel, and actually did in fact die eventually in Kashmir, up in India. And you can still go. I've never been there. It's too close to Pakistan for my taste, but it's, you got to be brave to go there.
Yeah.
God bless those missionaries working there. But there's a tomb of Jesus there. And I'm told that the locals always laugh when Westerners come there and pay an entrance fee, because they know nobody's buried there. Yeah. But there's gullible people who are gullible enough.
You can make a lot of money off gullible Americans, right?
Yeah. So you get there's a lot of wild theories out there. I've John Warwick Montgomery, who's a long-standing apologist in the Lutheran tradition, did a debate with a man named Shabir Ali, and he, through force of facts, got Shabir Ali to admit that, yes, Jesus must have been hung on a cross. And when Dr. Montgomery asked, well, so what happened when that soldier pierced his side and blood and water came out, because Shabir had to, because the Quran says he did not die. He said, yeah, he was put on a cross, but Allah must have taken him up unto himself. And Dr. Montgomery said, no, he died on a cross. There's ample evidence for it. In fact, the Journal of American Medical Association ran an article decades ago dissecting the accounts and said there's no way he survived or swooned or anything like that. So when the spear gets thrust into his side and blood and water comes out, Dr. Montgomery asked Shabir Ali, like, what's going on there? It pierced his pericardial sac. You're dead. If he wasn't dead already from it. And Shabir Ali jokingly said, I don't know what that was, but acknowledged that there was blood or there was something red there. He goes, it could have been ketchup. So
did he really?
So you get some pretty wild theories out there. And if somebody's worldview or understanding of history is not organized around historic facts, that's always the case. It always ends up in some wild conspiracy theory or assertion that, well, this is possible or that's possible. But, when you ask them, well, where's the evidence? They say, well, it's just a possibility. And I'm of the mind that, especially Christians in the case of Jesus, when we're talking about Jesus, if it's an apologetic type of context, just stick with the facts. The facts are all on our side. So,
yeah. Another question. These historical questions keep coming up. But so, what else about Muhammad? You mentioned the story of him, beheading, or maybe him and his people maybe beheading the 700 people from that Jewish tribe.
Yeah.
What else do we know about Muhammad? Like, was he a good character? Was he not a good character?
So,
I remember stories of like young concubines.
So maybe I should talk just a bit about the biographies that we have. It's said that there was a biography of Muhammad written about 100 years after his death. That's not extant anymore. There was a biography written about 200 years after his death that claims to have been derived from that earlier source. Whatever the case, it's still quite a ways removed from Muhammad's life. That doesn't mean it could, a recollection couldn't be accurate, especially in oral societies.
Photographic memory.
And, they can preserve histories very well. That's been demonstrated by anthropologists for some time now. But what you get in this biography is a lot of things that even more critical Muslim scholars will say are additions to the text to boost Muhammad's prophetic credentials, like apologetic devices, as they're sometimes called. So the Quran clearly says Muhammad did not perform miracles. Yet the earliest Muslim-authored biography says he performed miracles, but they're not miracles like Jesus performed. They're miracles that nobody else witnessed. For example, one night it said that he walked out of wherever he was sleeping, looked at the night sky and made a motion, and the moon fell in half. And one of it fell down of the sky, went in one shirt sleeve of his and came out the other and reattached itself. So you get these bizarre miracles taking place. the Quran doesn't, or says he did not. In fact, the Quran has a couple instances where the Jews say, we will not accept you as our prophet unless you can perform a miracle. And Muhammad says, I was not given the power to perform miracles, yet the biographies have it. So it seems that the biographies are suspect, not just because we don't want to believe it, but because it just doesn't, when you weigh the evidence, it doesn't seem like you can take it at face value. But if we're to just sort of go with it, the biographies do tell us that Muhammad, before he became a so-called prophet, was given like honorific titles like Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. And so he had a reputation of being a good, truthful a person. What else could we say about, I mean, there's lots more we could say. There must have been some sort of charisma. I think they call it, what the kids call it. He must have been a Rizzler, I think is the new term, if you've heard that too. He was, while he's not that successful in Mecca and attracting many followers, he was just a handful. When he gets to Medina, the whole city, he basically is given the keys to the city. And how that all was negotiated, of course, a Muslim would say it's all Allah's providence or something like that. But if that did indeed happen, that he's just sort of invited to the city to be the religious and the political leader, he had to be a connected man and have some sort of charisma and the trust of the people. So when he is there in Medina for 10 years, while the Islam and its theology gets more nuanced, it also gets, I would argue, and I know there's people who would argue differently, Islam gets increasingly intolerant, if not violent. I forget the number now, but there are all the passages enjoining Muslims to struggle, engage in a jihad. Jihad just can be translated struggle, maybe a holy struggle or something like that, come from this Medinan period. Not all, but the overwhelming majority of them are pretty clear that the struggle is to advance the cause of Islam through force.
Via the sword.
Via the sword. Now, there are some Muslim traditions that say, in fact, it's just one, that distinguish the greater jihad from the lesser jihad. That the greater jihad is you struggling with your temptations, your personal temptations into sin and so on. And so some will say, well, see, jihad can be interpreted to mean that a Muslim can focus inward at transforming themselves rather than transforming society or whatever it might be. But if you look at the weight of the evidence and all the traditions on jihad that have been written in Islamic languages over the centuries, when they're not trying to sell them, when Islam is not being sold to a Western secular audience, the greater jihad can only take place after the lesser jihad has been successful, after the borders of Islam have been extended, and there's an Islamic government and Islamic law is the law of the land. So, I mean, of course, this is a controversial point, but there's a book David Cook wrote, Understanding Jihad, which is simply his study of anything of any authority within the Islamic tradition that has been written on the topic. And he found that it is like almost completely understood as a expansion of the reach of Islam, whether it's by brute physical force, as was done in earlier centuries, or by mass migration, by slowly but surely working in a non-Muslim culture to transform the laws and gain more acceptance for Islam. That's you find the impulse for that in the Medinan period of Muhammad's life. In fact, one more thing on that, the last, what's called Muhammad's farewell sermon, the last speech he gives to the people of Medina, he says something to the effect that his mission, Allah had given him this mission to create this Islamic community, this ummah in the Arabian Peninsula, and now he was handing on orders to the Muslim community as he's getting old and sick to fight the world until the world confesses there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. And those are taking as marching orders by the successors to to Muhammad, the vice regents of Muhammad, the caliphs that come after him.
Mm.
And you see this, if I can go on here, like within 100 years, Islam reaches into the far western parts of China, into what we call like Pakistan is making inroads into India, all of North Africa, from Syria down to the Holy Land. Even Spain is conquered by Islam within 100 years of Muhammad's death. Its movement is not stopped really until 732 AD in the middle of France, when a guy named Charles Martel pushes them back into Spain, where it will remain until 1492. So
is that the first crusade?
That's the first jihad.
Or, I'm sorry, the first pushback. Is that?
So the first pushback is in a way, it's a kind of a pushback. So the Crusades, that's a complicated history, but they begin in the 11th century. The long and short of it is in 1080s, there's a church council happening in France. Pope Urban II is convening the council, and they're dealing with all sorts of other topics, like administrative issues in the church. And the Pope gets word that Christians living in the Holy Land, who had lived there under Islamic rule for some time, not necessarily comfortably, but they had certain rights. Christians and Jews can live under Islamic rule as sort of second-class citizens, as what are called dhimmis. They had been living there for some time, but a new Islamic power had moved into that area from Syria down to Jerusalem, known as the Seljuk Turks. And they had adopted a kind of aggressive form of Islam. When they start ruling over that region where there's a lot of Christians, they noticed that the way Christians were treated by the Arab Muslim entities didn't fall in line with Islamic law. So they began a pretty harsh period of persecution of Christians. And we got some accounts that are pretty graphic, that they would round Christians up, they would cut around their belly button and pull out their innards, tie it to a stick, nail it to the ground, and start whipping them so that they'd run around and their innards would pretty gruesome stuff. Women who are 8 months pregnant have their children ripped out of their womb and drowned in blood, in baptismal fonts. It gets pretty extreme. So the Pope gets wind of this, and I'm a Lutheran, so I'm not interested in defending the Pope at all. But he hears this account in the late 11th century. What's he to do?
Right,
there are Christians being slaughtered over in the Holy Land, and he takes that opportunity to preach the First Crusade. Now, I'm not an advocate for the Crusades, but they're completely it's understandable why they might have started if they're hearing reports of this. And these are fellow Christians, and they've got the opportunity to go and help or liberate them. Now, it gets pretty messy thereafter. But in that whole mix is also, and it's hard to know because we're like this is like 11th century history, and the source material is a little hard to know, like real particulars on, especially when it comes to intentions. But you do have a Pope Gregory VII, I think it was, who is starting to eye Spain and beginning what's called the Reconquista or the Reconquest of Spain. There's a slow, it takes over 3 centuries, pushing back against the Muslim entities that had conquered it in the 8th century. But it's 1492 when, as they say, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, when that finally Spain is completely reconquered and ruled over by Christian kings at that point. So,
well, let's jump to some of the theology. Let's take a quick break, and then I
like that idea.
Okay, sounds good. All right, and Mr. Bennett, wearing the Nebraska hockey hat, says we're back and ready to go.
Right,
so
let's do it.
What do you think? So let's jump to kind of just modern day Islam, right? So like, what should people understand, or how should we think about Islam today, and all the different thoughts, the different worries, the different questions.
Yeah, there's a lot there. In a parallel way to, say, Christianity, Islam has been decentralized in many ways. And so, contrary to centuries past, there's emerging different views within Islam that in earlier centuries would have been marginalized or dealt with harshly in some cases when there was a caliph, a central authority. So it is, and I know this maybe sounds cliche, but it is quite diverse. Islam is not monolithic. I don't know if it ever was, but I think it was closer to being monolithic in centuries past. Um, for people living in like the United States with a Muslim population here that seems to be growing, not radically, but in 30, 40 years, we've seen the number of mosques in the United States go from like 30 and I think is 1990 to over 3,000 now. So at least the footprint on American soil from Islam is growing. It's important not to assume that your Muslim neighbor or coworker or whatever, assume that you know what they think or how they feel about things. Because you'll oftentimes be surprised that some Muslims can be quite liberal.
Yeah.
I've been in mosques before. One mosque, I remember it quite distinctly, where the Friday sermon, where it was all about who the Muslims should vote for. And it happened to be a Democratic candidate that was quite liberal. And so they'll surprise you. At the same time, there is this, we didn't bullet point it, but there are 5 essential beliefs that Muslims are across the board are going to assume to be true. That's, the belief that God is one, that God or Allah created everything, including an invisible aspect to creation that's very active, that and a creation that is not fallen in anywhere close to way Christians, or at least Orthodox Christians, view it. A belief in a long train of prophets before Muhammad. That is, Islam is not an innovation, but rather Islam was the original religion, and Christianity or Judaism and Christianity are kind of offshoots away from it. At least reverential lip service, if that's a thing, towards the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel. Some Muslims will even now assert that the original Injil, the original Gospel, has been recovered. It's the Gospel of Barnabas, which has a Jesus who predicts a prophet named Muhammad and who doesn't die on a cross. As it turns out, the Gospel of Barnabas is a 15th century forgery, and we've known that for centuries, but it's awfully convenient for some of their polemics and apologetics. And so the 5th point is Muslims, like Christians in a parallel way, not the same way though, believe that there will be a day of judgment, and that's it. So I sometimes, when I'm teaching Islam to like Christian groups at on Sunday morning or something, when I don't have a whole lot of time, I'll say that Islam does parallel Christian thought in many ways, but the content's radically different. The two cannot be reconciled. That's probably should be no surprise. All this talk about there being Abrahamic faiths and things like that is sometimes used as a tool for Muslims to gain inroads into conversations with more liberal-leaning Christians. Other times it's just sort of liberal Christians being silly. I mean, that's not a very academic way of putting it, but that's really what it boils down to. I've been in these like interfaith kind of dialogue things. Early on, I kind of got sick of liberal Christians who denied cardinal doctrines of the Christian faith. So I wouldn't really count them Christians, but they called themselves Christians. They were the ones who showed up for these things. And I was like, well, a confessing biblical Christian should be there. So I would do these things. I was always surprised how the liberal Christian clergy person would oftentimes be much more in line with Islam than with me. So
they kind of hate Paul too, right? I mean, they kind of dismiss Paul.
Yeah, to be sure. Yeah. So Islam can be a mixed bag when it comes to the modern face of Islam. Thinking about Islam globally or geopolitically or maybe sociopolitically, one thing I think that we cannot we have to know about Islam, and this was put forward, and I don't remember the author's name, but there's a book called Islamic Exceptionalism, written by a Muslim at the Brookings Institute or institution that's a more secularized type of Muslim, but His thesis is, and I think he's quite right, is that when it comes to the future of Islam, one cannot dismiss the claims of what some would call like the fundamentalists or the extremists or whatnot, because those groups of Muslims do have the weight of Islamic tradition on their side in many ways. There are some things they do that are a pretty, not a radical departure, but a really extreme, narrow interpretation of something. But their desire to restore Islamic civilization to an age where there is a caliph is traditional Islam. How quickly you do it or how you go about it, they differ over that. But for 100 years, almost to the year, since World War I was over, and in the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, the country of Turkey emerges. The leader in all of that was a man named Kemal Ataturk, and he, I believe it was 1924, announced the dissolution of the caliphate. So after 1,300 years of this institution being the central political authority within Islam, and also the central political authority that had directed law and maintained the integrity of Islamic theology and so on, that's finally dissolved in 1924. And that opens up a whole ball of wildness, I guess, in that some Muslims took that as license, if you will, to pursue a more secularized Islam. And in fact, after World War I, the League of Nations assigned Britain and France in particular, there were others, but mostly Britain and France, the mandate or the obligation to supervise the development of what was once the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire being the Sunni Islamic Empire that extends back to like 1300, that persisted and even tried to break into Europe at the time of Martin Luther. The Ottoman Empire is taken apart after World War I. Britain and France are charged with supervising its development into these nation states and encouraging the locals to develop polities, governments. And as society evolves along with that, these Muslim societies, these conservative Muslim societies, become increasingly or start to look more like Western societies in terms of their politics, how their governments are set up. There's kings and prime ministers and presidents. That's not in the Islamic political repertoire. And then culture follows suit. And so, and some Muslims enjoyed that liberty to do that and followed more of a secularized separation of mosque and state kind of approach to Islam. But there was always this discontent among some Muslims, and it starts in Egypt in 1924 with the rise of a group called the Muslim Brotherhood, whose goal was they believe when the Ottoman Empire was taken apart and non-Muslim entities were given authority to some extent or another in those countries, they believed that Islamic civilization was receding. And they've always had as their goal, and they've grown ever since. They're found everywhere around the world now, and they have all sorts of offshoot organizations. In America, there are about a dozen of them, or 24 at least at this point, like the Muslim Student Association, Islamic Society of North America, and so on, that are at least adjacent or offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood who have as their intention to restore Islamic civilization wherever it might be restored. And what they mean by that is a restoration of Islamic norms, legal and perhaps ultimately, gradually political, and everything else following suit. Along with the Muslim Brotherhood, there are other more overtly violent organizations that are pursuing very similar ends. So thinking about Islam today, while we all might, and we probably should be somewhat thankful that the Muslims in America tend to be assimilating into American culture, there still will always be with us, argue Muslim scholars themselves, that contingency of Muslims who read their Quran and know their tradition and know that secularized forms of Islam are not, do not correspond to anything in Islamic tradition. And so there's going to be a contest. There already is in various places in the Muslim majority world and even in the Western world between Muslims over what's the true nature of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could be that the majority wins, and so maybe a more assimilated Islam becomes the norm. It could also be that those who are who have grown up in the Western world, Muslims growing up in the Western world, will be reacquainted with their tradition and realize the liberal Islam, if you will, that they kind of grew up in isn't the real deal, and they'll revert back to a more strident form. I made this joke once years ago, and it's not off color. It might get me in trouble, but like Muhammad, I'm no prophet.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how it's all going to pan out, but it could go in nothing should surprise us.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing all sorts of new faces to Islam emerge in the Western world. For Americans in particular, as we bump up or work alongside or befriend or, study with Muslims, I think it gives us opportunities to get to know and to understand Islam in ways that, for example, in the early days of the War on Terror, those opportunities didn't present themselves as much because Muslims believed, in some cases it was true, they were being observed and surveyed by FBI and so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. And that's kind of softening, and Muslims are becoming more and more are more open to having non-Muslim friends and so on. So there's those opportunities, and for the Christian, that presents certainly opportunities to speak truth to Islam, truth concerning who Jesus really was, and so on. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
It's hard to know. It's easy to be paranoid about
Mm-hmm.
Islam. You see, like in the mainstream media, and there is a track record. There's a very long history of violence in Islam. Samuel Huntington once quoted a Muslim scholar. He got in trouble for this in his book, Clash of Civilizations. He said, Islam has always had bloody borders.
Mm.
We might not like that. The Muslim might not like the way that's expressed, but that is the historical record. And so I suspect, people have been talking since the War on Terror began that in America, it's not if another major attack happens, but when.
Mm-hmm.
I think that day is getting even closer,
Mm-hmm.
especially given Can I get into politics here a little bit without being partisan? With a border that is extremely porous and people coming from all parts of the world, including the Muslim majority worlds. Many of them, I'm pretty convinced, and maybe I'm naive for this, are here because they're looking for a better life. America, despite its failings, is still the last best hope. I think people are drawn to that. There are people, however, who have very ill intentions, whether it's from the drug cartel or from jihadist groups in the Muslim majority world that are making their way over. I don't know. I don't have access to this information. I don't have a security clearance anymore, or have a need to know, apparently. But the rumblings are that there have been dozens of folks observed and some of them caught who have been on the terrorist watch list. So I'm a little, living near a big city, that does concern me. I won't let my concern for that, though, kind of blind or give me. I don't want to automatically then be suspicious of every Muslim person, though. I think that would be not just uncharitable, but would not be in keeping with the 8th commandment. We're to speak well of our neighbor, regardless of who they are. Defend them and so on. But it is a reality. I think about the future for my kids, and I'm like, well, it's not going to be pretty. In addition to all the weird stuff going on in our culture, you got this stuff looming on the horizon too, yet again. So
what do you want to speak to any more? You kind of mentioned, there's all these reports of Muslim, but even you'll have like these huge groups, and it's not like families and children, but you have these huge groups that are just, 20s and 30s, all men coming across. Some of them are all Chinese, and some of them are from China, and some of them are, all Muslim. Like, what's your thoughts on that? Like, or do you have any rumblings of like goals,
Yeah, I
as
mean,
far as causing uprisings and stuff.
people talk about it as an invasion.
Hmm.
People on the right, or I guess it's called the right. And I don't think that's inaccurate. But by an invasion, that I don't know that there's like somebody behind the scenes dictating it all.
Hmm.
I think there are small actors to be. The cartel for sure
Yep.
is managing or dictating certain things. People from mainland China, members of the Communist Party, is that part of a larger plan, or are they just migrating here for a better way of life? Hard to know. Um, but there's ample historical evidence that anytime your borders are that porous, that makes you extremely vulnerable. Empires and nation states fall because of those sorts of things. That's
Hmm.
not to say that, that's not to argue for like a zero tolerance for migration policy by any stretch of the imagination.
Hmm.
But a border that's a little secure and that is able to manage who's coming in
Hmm.
is, I don't want to lay down political cards too much, but that's what a nation state is. It's defined by its borders, and if you
Yep.
don't have a border, you're not a serious nation state.
Hmm. Let me ask you this: what should people think about Hamas and Israel right now?
Ooh, that's the $1 million question.
Hmm.
So what happened on October 7th was, horrific. That Israel has responded, like Benjamin Netanyahu has said they will not stop until they extinguish Hamas, I think is more than justified.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's terribly naive and utopian to think that there won't be lots of collateral damage. There always is collateral damage in war. It'd be unreasonable to demand that for Israel that they, give a limit to how high that collateral damage is as they're trying to pursue Hamas.
Hmm.
It's awful to be sure. Among the Palestinians who are not connected to Hamas, they're not all. There's a minority Christian population there. They're not all supportive of Hamas, although they ostensibly voted Hamas in.
Hmm.
Now, whether those were fair and open elections, that's a big
Yeah.
if. Hamas has been around since I think it was 1987 when they were formed, and they're an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're a violent offshoot that has very overtly said ever since, as part of their charter, that their goal is to wipe Israel off the map.
Hmm.
They're always, I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not an Israeli citizen.
Hmm.
I can't be one because I'm not a Jew.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm no Zionist or anything like that, but just as a normal course of politics, a nation gets attacked and children and women are raped and slaughtered and so on. How else was Israel to respond? Now, in that whole mix is this sort of ideological debate over whether Israel has the right to exist in the first place.
Hmm.
And there's a whole lot of baloney. I had stronger words for it, but we're on the air. A whole lot of baloney over the history of Israel. I have Muslim friends who insist that that land belongs to the Palestinians, to which I always want to say, but they never let me get it word edgewise. Why does it belong to the Palestinians? Because before them existed another people group. And you can trace the history of people who have lived in the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, way back, and it's just constantly changing, So, and if you look at the history of Israel, the population that emerged there right before Israel was announced as a nation state, and I think it was May 14th of 1948, those Jewish people had been migrating there since at least the 1890s, if not the 1880s. They were migrating there mostly because of a rise in anti-Semitism, especially in Eastern Europe. When it starts popping up in Western Europe, like with the Alfred Dreyfus affair in France, that's when Jewish populations in Europe start to get really concerned, and you get the rise of Zionism, a Jewish nationalism, and they begin looking for places to settle where they could be a nation state themselves. And there were different things floated, different places. Madagascar, interestingly, was one of them. They were able to, though, gain permission from the authorities over Palestine at that time, that is the Ottoman Sultan, to begin migrating there. And as they start migrating to the Holy Land, and whether it was through mischievous means or not, I have no idea. They weren't keeping great records back then, but they start buying up the land. So as a real estate issue, much of Israel was purchased. The real estate of Israel was purchased by Jewish settlers in that territory, purchased rightfully from the Ottoman authorities. So I think the claim that Israel is sort of a colonial state, some of it gains a little traction when you look at its expansion into like the Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, the West Bank, in times past. But it was built, in a way, kind of inductively, just from migrations that were legal. Now there's a whole history of atrocities from Palestinians and Israelis, or what would become Israelis, over the course of that history. It's a messy and complicated history, but I'm of the mind, my politics, if you will, is that a nation state only has the right to exist only insofar as it's able to control and preserve its borders. Maybe that's a Hobbesian view of politics, but the Jewish claim that Israel, the modern state of Israel, was given to God, given to the Jewish people way back when, I don't think holds true. Israel is no longer. There's a new Israel. It's the church. So, but that's a Christian interpretation of it, right?
Yeah.
Now, from the Muslim side, when they claim that the Palestinians have the right to land, that's largely a guise. What they mean by that is that land was conquered by Islam starting in the 630s, right after Muhammad's death. I think it was Jerusalem fell in 637, and thereafter the rest of the region. In classic Islamic ideology, when a land is conquered and absorbed into what's called Darul Islam, the domain of Islam, it cannot be relinquished. It belongs to Islam. So you will not see conflict ever subside over in that particular region, so long as the Jewish state of Israel exists, because it's seen as an affront to Allah. It's in a way, kind of the first duty of Muslims to take that land back. And guess what will be the second target if Israel ever falls? Spain is the second, because it was once Islamic territory. So, again, I don't think there are people like behind curtains pulling strings and things like this, but it's in the the charters and the fatwas and the memorandums and the treatises of organizations. Al Qaeda, for example, is quite Bin Laden was quite overt that their biggest gripe was with the West was not that the Westerners were secular and so on. It was because the West supported Israel. And Israel does not have a right to exist according to that stream of Islamic thought. So what's going on in Gaza, it's really hard to even know what's going on, because depending on your sources, immediately after the Israelis, IDF goes in and rescues a hostage, for example, numbers are reported from the Palestinian side that say hundreds and hundreds of people are killed, but like immediately, like no investigation is done or anything. I'm pretty convinced, and both right and left leaning sources are convinced that those numbers are just sort of like knee-jerk propagandic numbers. That's not to say that there aren't lots and lots of innocents killed, caught in the crossfire, and that's an awful thing. That's not in my vocation to figure out how to sort that out.
Right. Yeah. Every person I watch that talks about that, it's just like, there's no way to, these numbers that we're getting are just, there's so many different motives going into how these numbers are being reported. And it's really tough to get to the real facts.
And there've been some some numbers reported from the Palestinian side that are like real 500 people or something died. And then a couple days passed, some investigations done, and the number is corrected to like 12 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no retraction. It's pretty clear it's a propagandic war, and probably from both sides.
Mm-hmm.
For the person who's not a citizen of Israel, I mean, it's my sympathies are with Israel,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't have a dog or a vocation in that fight.
There's always wars, right? There's no shortage of wars.
Sadly, yeah. And I think thinking in the future, expect more of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a very pessimistic view, but only the dead. I forget I think it was Thucydides say, only the dead see the end of war.
Mm.
It's just, that's the thing that it's in many ways, historians, that's how they mark periods in history is around conflicts, because it's just perennial.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more question. We can kind of wrap up on this because I think we've hinted towards this a couple of times. So what's the picture, kind of that apocryphal, like the end times picture for Islam? Like,
yeah. There's not a uniform one.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference between the Sunni and the Shia, or the Shiites, as we typically call them. So Sunni and Shiite, 85 to 90% of the Muslim world would be Sunni. Those are traditionalists. Sunni means a tradition,
mm-hmm.
or Sunnah means tradition, from which we get Sunni. What marks them as distinct is at least their classical ideology is that Islam does not change. That is, the task of Islamic authorities is to preserve the message and the moral example of Muhammad intact without transforming it, changing it, adding to or subtracting from it until the end.
Mm-hmm.
Shia, they're 10 to 15% of the Muslim world. They're found scattered around the Muslim majority of the world, but especially concentrated in Iran. Believe that in the early days, when there was the Sunni Shia split, that when Muhammad died and gave orders for the Muslim community to begin expanding, they would encounter cultures and questions that Muhammad never had to address. And so somebody had to be able to discern what Allah's will was with respect to those sorts of questions and challenges that face Muslims that Muhammad didn't have an answer for, or Muhammad's
Mm-hmm.
example didn't give a precedent for. So for the Shiite, the leader of Muslims across the world should be somebody who's attached to Muhammad's bloodline, because they would have a special charisma.
Mm.
It's not it's not too entirely different, but it's not exactly the same as like a divine right of kings kind of concept that emerges in the West in the 16th, 17th centuries. But so Ali was the first guy that the Shiite belief should rule over the Muslim people. He doesn't become caliph until the third one is assassinated. But ever since, they've gone to war with each other over who the nature of Islamic authority.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where the last or the end times kind of scenarios come in. In Shiite theology or view of the end times, there will be a final judgment. But as that's all taking place, Jesus is going to return to history alongside an Islamic Mahdi, an Islamic Messiah. And there's different versions of it, but in Shiite ideology or theology, they believe that there was a caliph back in the Middle Ages, a young boy actually, who became caliph after his dad died, who is connected to Muhammad's bloodline, who was supposed to be the rightful ruler over the Muslim world. I think he was about 6 years of age. And as he's reciting the prayers, the Quran at his father's funeral, he goes into what's called occultation, or hiding. He disappears like from visible physical history, and he's been hiding ever since. He's called the hidden imam. And at least official Iranian ideology says that imam, that rightful ruler of Muslims everywhere, is also the Mahdi, and he's been hiding in a well ever since. So you're maybe too young to remember this. You probably would have been in your teens at best. But there was a time when an old Iranian president named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad So this would be like the first decade of the 21st century. So maybe you were old enough to remember this, but if it made the news, he went out, he marched with the Ayatollah Khamenei and all the mullahs, the Shiite clergy, to this well, and he dropped slips of papers down this well. And it was reported that he was dropping requests down the well so that the hidden imam might find them and come out of hiding and usher in the last day. So there's a sense that, at least in Shiite apocalyptic thought, that the Islamic Messiah his hand can kind of be forced. And so, you got to take people who are involved in like American intelligence, CIA and things like that, State Department, have to take this stuff seriously, because with Iran and its desire for nuclear weapons, and this ideology coupled with it, you lob a nuke at Israel, and then Israel responds in kind times 10. It could be that that's for them a scenario that would force the return of the Islamic Mahdi. And the way it's sometimes described, you can find this in Islamic traditional literature, that when the Mahdi returns, he's going to usher in an era where there's a global Islamic caliphate. Everybody will be converted to Islam. Jews will be slaughtered. Pigs will be killed everywhere, and crucifixes will be brought together and crushed. That's not totally specific to the Shiite tradition, but that's where you find it really emphasized. The Sunni tradition believes there's a last day, and it's not like they're like millennialists, where they're like, well, it's going to happen. We're just not sure how it's going to happen. But they have all sorts of competing scenarios that aren't as discrete as the Shiite tradition, but are, they will get in particulars like that. They're all agreed, though, that there will be an Islamic Messiah that comes, and Jesus will return at the last day and judge. He will disown Christianity, and the last judgment will begin to take place. So,
what does that last judgment look like? Is it the end of time, and there's kind of like this eternal judgment, or is it some kind of earthly judgment?
The Quran gives different images of this. Some say that all the living and the dead will be raised, and they'll be judged on the basis of their good and bad deeds. And the Quran gives us this picture that there will be every person has scrolls, two scrolls that are being recorded on. An angel is recording all your bad deeds, and another angel is recording all your good deeds. And depending as those scrolls are unraveled before Allah, the longer one's going to determine your fate, whether you go to paradise or whether you go to hellfire for eternity. There is also, though, some pictures in the Quran that suggests that there will be surprises at the last day, where there will be some who are Muslims and devout Muslims who will be in hellfire, and there will be those who are not Muslims who will be in paradise. So there's some tension there. Muslims they have a way of working these things out. And then there's another picture in the Quran that says where one ends up after the judgment is determined even before you're born. So like a kind of a double predestinarian view of salvation and damnation, that Allah has already predetermined it even before you're born. Some are reprobate. I don't know that they would use that language. It's more like Calvinistic language, but then some are elect.
Interesting.
So,
one last question. Is there 72 virgins?
So do you want me to get in the weeds on this one?
Go for it, yeah.
The number is not given in the Quran.
Okay.
The Quran does say, though, that one goes to paradise, especially dying in Jihad fi sabil Allah, struggling in the path of Allah. One dies. That's when you know for certain. That's the only time you can know you certainly will go to paradise. But as you're dying as a so-called martyr in Islam, the virgins will entice you up and say, "Come on up here, come on up to us," right? And you'll be given all sorts of. You'll live a very lavish lifestyle there in paradise with your, I forget what the Arabic term is now, but they're basically these houris is what they're called. These black-eyed virgins who only have eyes for you. Now it's this body of literature called the Hadith, sayings and doings of Muhammad that didn't make their way into the Quran that give the number that it's 72.
Okay.
Now, to get into the weeds just one more time, there's a Muslim or a scholar of Islam who noticed that Huri might not be best translated as virgin, but rather as dates, like the kind that you eat,
Oh,
so it could
okay.
be you're going to get 72.
We would
72 dates.
We wouldn't have as many suicide bombers if it was just 72
that's
dates.
Right. Yeah. So that on that point, it's interesting. There's Muslims who push back and say, "Oh, that's not in the Quran." It's true, the number is not in the Quran, but the promise for a very what is lavish and sensuous end is in the Quran for sure. And in fact, the sort of like the last will and testament of suicide bombers, whether it's written or expressed to their parents as they're going off to jihad or whatever. Not all of it, but a lot of it is them expressing their desire to be in paradise with their virgins. So I mean, there is a big draw. That is a big draw. It's not something made up by the West. Yeah. There is also I get the question a lot when I used to do seminars on Islam. Well, what do women get? And I think it's just one place in the Hadith that say that women get their equal too. They get these big men. Yeah. So
big burly men.
Yeah. So I won't say more. It gets a little sensual and kind of embarrassing, but that's all I'll say on that.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thanks. This has been great.
It's been fun.
Yeah, we'd love to have you back on. We can bring you to our studio maybe next time. And
you should come to Wheaton.
Yeah, we could come to Wheaton. Actually, there'd be a couple people we could interview in Wheaton. I'm sure. Yeah. So
sounds good.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the time.
Yeah.
God bless and cheers.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.